we'll see divisions in New England. We talked about, originally when I opened up with this lecture, I told you there's a divided Protestantism, but the Great Awakening will bring unity. The one place we really don't see that, well, there's kind of two, but the most obvious one is in Puritan New England. There will be groups called Old Lights and groups called New Lights, okay? Who do you think named the other group? Old named them New? Does it sound better to be a New Light or an Old Light? A New Light, okay. So the New Lights called them the Old Lights. And basically these were Puritans that rejected the Great Awakening. They thought it was wrong. You shouldn't be preaching outside. They were so wrapped up in Calvinism. They're like, how do you know you can't evangelize because you don't know if they're predestined or not. And so those were the people that Jonathan Edwards was kind of opposing, defending the Great Awakening against. So New England, we see divisions within the Puritan Church, which is not normal for the Great Awakening. Most of the time we see unity. Middle colonies, we see unity, evangelical thought. The church is becoming closer. The church is sharing pulpits, sharing pastors, hosting events together. So we see more unity. And I use the word evangelical there, which we could do a whole lecture on the word evangelical. The word, if we wanted to. So, but we don't want to, right? I don't think you want to lecture on that. But it's very interesting, in my opinion, because now evangelical is part of the political narrative, and it's taken on a different, anyway. So we'll avoid that. But the South we see a rise of the Baptists. We'll also see the Methodist Church come. We'll see a little bit more division here with the Anglican Church, but for the most part, the Baptists are going to grow because people leaving the Anglican Church will often join the Baptist Church. So any Baptists in here?
I grew up Baptist.
Okay, I grew up Baptist. So largest Protestant denomination in the world is the Southern Baptist Church. So this is where they kind of get their rise. Were you Southern Baptist or just Baptist? Wow. Okay. Preaching to the underclasses. Really cool stuff to come out of the First Great Awakening was people going to kind of the classless in society. Those people that are outside of the normal middle, upper, lower class. And so we see David and John Brainerd, again, a classically great last name, Brainerd. They go to the Native Americans. They're impacted by the Great Awakening. This is a total history teacher thing, but the other night my daughter couldn't sleep. And so she was like, come find me if you can't sleep. And so she crawled in bed with me, and we read the diary of David Brainerd together. It was great, except she was tired and then she fell asleep. Written by Jonathan Edwards. So they get impacted by the First Great Awakening and are like, they are moved with compassion and an evangelistic kind of yearning to go and take the gospel to the Native Americans. They don't know it. Let's just not see them as enemies. Let's take them the gospel. This had been going on, but mainly from Catholics. Like the Protestants weren't too evangelistic with the Native Americans. And so that came out of the First Great Awakening. Gilbert Tennant and Samuel Davies, they went to the slaves. Again, not many Protestants viewed slaves as someone to evangelize. Coming out of the First Great Awakening, we'll see that. And so these two men purposely started creating movements and reaching out to slaves with the gospel. A guy named Samuel Hopkins, he'll begin, I won't say he began the abolition movement, that would not be true, but he joined in it and became a very fervent abolitionist. So the First Great Awakening, he experienced revival. That motivated him to join the movement, help the movement of abolition. While the First Continental Congress was meeting and getting ready to declare independence, Hopkins is sending them a pamphlet about abolition. So early on, there's an abolitionist movement. We'll watch a little bit of a video where you see a little bit of that, but the tension will be there that they're afraid the southern colonies will not join in the Revolutionary War if they also end slavery. But Samuel Hopkins is one who's encouraging them to, and again, that's a result of the First Great Awakening. So there are some negative aspects, obviously, of Christians using the Bible to defend slavery. Hopkins is an example of someone who God's Spirit moves on him and he works against slavery. I'm going to give you 4 effects, why I think it's significant. I'll run through these pretty quickly. It was America's first national event. The first thing that happened in basically throughout the colonies, from Georgia to Massachusetts, they all experienced the same thing. And historians look at this as kind of the first time that happened among the colonies, that what Pennsylvania is experiencing, so is South Carolina. Maine doesn't exist yet, Maine's Massachusetts. Massachusetts is experiencing, so is Georgia. So it's our first national event. All these colonies experienced it. It led, I would say, it gave a start and impetus to the melting pot of America, specifically breaking down barriers of religion, more so religion. At this point, I mean, you don't really have many Irish over here, so it's not that ethnically diverse. They're mainly English, but it is breaking down kind of that division of religion, and so a melting pot of religion here in America. It leads and kind of continues this growing distrust of England. We're already getting a little bit frustrated as salutary neglect is ending. Britain's kind of basically pulling back. They're starting to re-exert themselves and their control over the colonies. And so there's already that there. And then a lot of the Anglican churches did not embrace this revival, and it just gave them more notion of we're different from them. The English church is different from us. So don't quite trust the English, so kind of a rise of patriots. And then individual religion kind of goes hand in hand with our individual spirit, rugged individualism of Americans. This really showed that you can go to God on your own, you can talk to God and He will impact you, you can experience God, you don't have to go through a pastor. And so I think that feeds into the individualism of America. Okay, so that ends that lecture. Let's go to chapter 4. So what you're hopefully going to be reading. What'd you say? That was my side note, which you'll have questions from it in the chapter 4 reading quiz on Thursday. That's my own lecture, going a little bit deeper into our straight away. All right, now what you'll be reading here. Again, this is, you'll read some of the exact same stuff coming right from your textbook here. This is chapter 4 of their PowerPoint. I just highlight things that I think are important, which again, I wrote the quiz, so you probably won't be aware of that. What this chapter will talk a lot about, focus on, is the Chesapeake and the New England colonies. And the AP exam, one thing they like to draw a distinction of and have you think through is the difference between these two areas. So where's the Chesapeake again? What colonies around it. Okay, Virginia, Maryland, all that area. So if we're looking at a map up here, this area in here is the Chesapeake. So Virginia. Ooh, I just saw an interesting discussion that there's actual discussion about making Washington D.C. a state.
Oh, yeah.
Did you see that?
What? Interesting.
So it's actually on it's in Congress, which my children and I were talking about, like Puerto Rico, like bringing them in as a state. Like that could be a good thing. I don't know if they fully want it, but they're a protectorate of us. But we were like, maybe we could trade out Michigan, so it'd be great to maybe we could give Michigan to Canada, and then I thought we could get British Columbia. That way we could almost access Alaska by land, and we get rid of Michigan. It's like a win-win for us. So just saying. But I didn't know anything about DC.
Pretty sure Canada's not one associated with us.
Well, I know. We'd have to pay them to take Michigan, like it wouldn't be. So, we'd see how that would work out. But the issue is if we bring in a new state, it really messes up our flag, right? Because we have 50 stars, so that's why we have to exchange, or we have to bring in several more to make the flag work. So
50 nifty, you gotta change all that.
yeah.
I tried to convince my little brother that the stars on the flag were like the amount of presidents.
And they add one every
Yeah.
time you're doing. That's
And
funny.
then my
But
dad
you
was like,
did
"But
that
there's
for
only."
you.
Well, then my dad was like, "Yeah, but there's only 48 presidents." And I was like, "No, it hasn't been."
Oh, no one too far.
Didn't work.
Can I go back? Sorry. All right. So back to the Chesapeake. Sorry about that. How do I go back here? This is where I don't know how to use it. one of those say bag? There you go. Okay, we got it. All right. Sorry for my interrupting. So the Chesapeake was a very unhealthy region, so it's important to understand that. It's going to be very, very different from New England in terms of health, in terms of crops, in terms of makeup of towns. And so it grew pretty slowly. The people coming over are primarily young men coming, oftentimes as indentured servants. So you don't get many families. U.S. history, I open up and I give them two basically lists of ships that come over and who's on board. And what you see is going into New England, you have husbands, wives, and families, a larger age range. Coming to the Chesapeake region, you basically have teens to 20-year-olds, almost no children, and the ratio of men to women is about 6 to 1, men to women. So they continued to grow, but it was very slow. By the end of the 17th century, the white population was growing. Not many slaves yet. We're going to talk about why they start showing up. The crop that saves them is, of course, tobacco. However, because they didn't rotate their crops, they exploited the soil very quickly, and so that made them have to keep pushing west, more north. And so that's going to bring them in conflict with who? Native Americans are out there. Okay? So that's going to be some of the tension as we get to Bacon's rebellion to talk about here. So you can see these numbers, 1630s, 1.5 million pounds of tobacco. By 1700, almost 40 million pounds of tobacco. So it becomes the nation's cash crop. It's really what saves the Chesapeake. It will depress the prices, but without it, it never would have made it. And oddly enough, because of it, it's going to force them to push more and more inward, creating conflict. The headright system you're going to be familiar with. As they were growing more and more tobacco, they needed more labor, and they first looked to indentured servants. And so Virginia and Maryland passed a law, the colonies, called the headright system. And so let me explain what that is for you. The headright system basically it wanted to encourage plantation owners to bring over indentured servants. So to do that, they said, for everyone you bring over, we will give you more land. So you bring over an indentured servant, you get so many more acres, which seems to work. It does motivate them. But what's that going to do to the class system? Who's going to get richer? The rich get richer, okay? So basically the indentured servants are coming over, working off their debt, then they're free and they have no land, and the plantations are just getting bigger and bigger as they're getting rewarded for bringing them over. So it's going to create a greater divide between the haves and the have-nots over here. Again, an indentured servant, you served anywhere from 4 to 10 years, depending on how much the cost of passage was over, and so you're basically a slave until that ended, and then you're on your own. You weren't guaranteed anything from that point on. They get frustrated because of this disparity in wealth between the plantation owners and then the indentured servants and the freed indentured servants. Once they paid off their debt, they get frustrated because there's not women to marry. So when you have 6 to 1, it's like the goal is to come over here and make money, but it takes so long to get out of the indentured servant contract that then you have to make money, and then can you go back to England, but your money's tied here, and women aren't coming over. So they get frustrated with that, so not many families here. Governor Berkeley will be the governor of this region in the Chesapeake, and so Bacon's rebellion is what he will face, and Bacon's rebellion is extremely significant. So basically Bacon and his followers, so he was a freed indentured servant who led an uprising, frustrated with Governor Berkeley for not letting them move west. So as an indentured servant, he didn't want any land. The only land is to the west, and that's Native American land. But anytime they try to go, Berkeley says, no, we can't go west, we can't take that land. Part of the reason was Governor Berkeley had a very wealthy, very productive and prosperous trade agreement with the Native Americans. So he wanted to keep them happy because he was getting rich from the fur trade with them. The indentured servants and former indentured servants were getting more frustrated because they couldn't get land. And so ultimately, Bacon and his followers will they'll take it into their own hands, and they'll just attack the Native Americans and burn several villages, kill several tribes, and then they'll turn on Jamestown and burn Jamestown. So this is a significant rebellion that results in terrible relations with the Native Americans, the killing of many Native Americans, the destroying of Jamestown, that basically fizzles out because Bacon dies of dysentery. So the leader gets dysentery, he dies, and just kind of fizzles. And so Berkeley's able to get troops in and brutally suppress this uprising. The reason why it's so significant is right here, and what you got to know when everything of Bacon's rebellion, this is what you have to associate with it. They see indentured servants as a problem. It's not a useful labor source. It's expensive. It ends up with these frustrated European workers, and that's when they're going to turn from indentured servitude to slaves. Like, okay, let's get people that are slaves the entire time. They never get free, then we don't run into that problem. So historians look at Bacon's rebellion, and what you want to know about it is this turning point in colonial history when they turn to slavery as the source of their labor and away from indentured servitude. Okay, good on that slide? Okay. So, quickly on slavery, and we'll talk about it more later, and we're going to do several things about this. What time is it? What do we got? We're going to talk about this. Really good book, although controversial, Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi. Has become, with the uprisings, with the political movements right now, very popular book. He is very much anti-Trump, so, and it's right there in the introduction. So I was surprised, and I was talking with some people about this in the APUSH. I was surprised he went that route with it in the intro, because it is really good history in there. But he has another book called How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I think is good, and we'll talk about that, because there's even controversy around that word now. Critical race theory is another word thrown around right now, and how we respond to that. So his concept, Kendi's concept, is you have to be anti-racist. You can't just say I'm not racist. Like, you got to be against racism and work against it. And I think he has some very, very good, valid points. So we'll talk about that some more. Here's kind of the rise of slavery in the colonies. 7 million slaves will be brought here over 300 years. We'll look at a map later on a map day Monday that kind of shows where slaves went. Many, many more slaves will go to South America. Brazil takes in so many more slaves than we do. However, we enacted a very brutal form of slavery with no acceptance of slaves within society. So we'll talk about those differences. 1619, you should know. It's become a very important date and a date of connection. Anybody heard it recently? Because it's been in the news in like the last week. So 1619 is the earliest day we see that slaves were brought to the colonies. So if we're going to say slavery began, people go back to this date. There's been articles written on it. The New York Times has a whole website called 1619. It's got a podcast, and it's controversial because some of the stuff that's stated in it. And so I would say basically, on the pendulum, it's swung pretty far to one side on the pendulum. Doesn't mean it's not good. There's a ton of great resources in there. But Trump even came out recently and threatened to take away funding from schools that use 1619 in their curriculum. And so we can talk about that more a little bit later, and why. I'm still trying to get to the bottom of exactly what is so controversial of it in terms of how it presents slavery. There's other people that are frustrated with it for other reasons, because they were slaves much earlier than that in other parts of the Americas, so can we really say it starts then? But in general, you should know that date as the first time slaves stepped ashore of the colonies. They weren't scheduled to, they just kind of showed up. There's only like 20 of them aboard a ship. I think they were Dutch. But anyway, that's the first time we have slaves come to the colonies. By 1670, 7% of the southern population will be slaves. They were very expensive, so it'll take some time for the market to grow, the plantations to get to a point. We'll talk later about how very few Southerners actually had slaves. The plantations would have massive amounts of slaves, but it was kind of seen as the American dream in the South. Like, oh, if I could get one slave, well, then I could start producing crop, and then I could get two, then I could get three. And so that was kind of their American dream way to success, was could you get a slave? But most Southerners didn't have slaves, because they were very expensive. Let's see. By the mid-1680s, more black slaves than white servants came into plantation colonies. So we see this switch, as we talked about, following Bacon's Rebellion, where we'll see now they're shifting to African Americans as their slaves instead of indentured servitude. 1698, Royal African Company lost a monopoly on the market. We'll see Rhode Islanders, which is just like, wait, you were the colony we were excited about, because like religious freedom and everything. They'll lead the way in entering the slave trade and sailing, getting the slaves and bringing them back. And most are coming from West Africa. If you want to see, you'll see maps in there. So take a look at those maps. Remember on their quizzes, I'm asking questions about maps and pictures. But the most, it's called the triangular trade route. And the terrible part of it is the Middle Passage. So have you heard the phrase Middle Passage? Not if you've heard it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. This is the passage from Africa to the colonies or South America or the Caribbean, in which basically the slave ships, the slavers, their goal was quantity, not quality. So they tried to fit as many slaves on board as they could. If they got sick and died, they just throw them overboard. So it'd be, to them, is the same mindset as like if you're going to bring bananas here, you try to keep the bananas healthy and like a limited amount in good condition, or just fit as many as you can and throw out the bad ones. And that was most of their approach. So the Middle Passage is just brutal. We just watched Black Panther this weekend with my girls. So right at the end, how many seen Black Panther? You all seen it? Don't want to give away Maddie? Okay. So I'll try not to give a spoiler, but at the end, one of the guys who dies, he's just like, let me die like my brothers who jumped from the slave ships. Like, I don't put me in prison. I don't want to be in shackles. And so this Middle Passage is just, it was awful. And when you see the ships and how they designed them so they can fit as many people chained head to foot, basically you're given 2 feet wide by 6 feet long, and that was it, pretty much. And you're chained down there. You could get up and come to the top for like exercise each day, but that's where you urinated if you had to go. It's just foul conditions.
I read somewhere that in Africa, like in West Africa at that time, that's how like braids were originated. It's like they would braid rice into the hair of young girls so they'd have something to eat on the slave ships.
I haven't heard that at all, so that's interesting.
I don't know that it was like the origination of braids, but like I heard like that's what they used to do.
So in general, it's also difficult because slavery was a part of society at that time. So even when the Europeans were getting the slaves, they weren't capturing them and making them slaves. Other Africans were selling them to them. So African nations would go and tribes would conquer other tribes, take them and sell them to the Europeans as slaves. So it's difficult. Now slavery in West Africa didn't look anything like slavery in the colonies. They were much more a part of the family. Eventually you could get your freedom, possibly you could marry into the family. Like it was totally different from how it became in the colonies. So slave codes you read about, we kind of talked about, but we'll move on from that. And let's see. This concept here, there's these great planter families, the Fitzhughs, the Lees, the Washingtons, are kind of the great planter families of the South. The first families of Virginia is an important concept, concept to know. Any family established before 1690 basically became, like they were the aristocrats of the South in that. Where are we at time-wise? Almost. Let's jump ahead to New England. So contrasting the Chesapeake, and don't worry, we'll talk more about slavery. That is not where we'll stop with that. But it's in this chapter in that kind of those sections. The New England family, very different from how kind of the life in the Chesapeake. The New England settlers of 1600 added 10 years to their lifespan. Oftentimes those first generations of Puritans averaged 70 years of age. So it's very different from the Chesapeake. Again, they came over as families. Their goal was to stay and create a family. So even if their wife died while here, they often married and had a family. Their population was just growing mainly from natural reproduction, in addition to people coming over, but a lot of it coming from that. There's a booming birth rate up in New England. Women got married in their early 20s and averaged a baby every 2 years. So large families. In general, like you'll see that most of them will have 10 to 8 children in their family. Typically, if you go throughout the Middle Ages, it's just a very high infant mortality rate. So most women are going to experience 1 or 2 deaths. And that's actually pretty good for the colonies. So it's very different from our mindset. Like if someone were to lose a baby now, and we're not talking like in birth, we're talking like within the first year, it's devastating for us because it's so rare. Back then, not so much. I mean, it was very common to lose a child before the age of 3. It wasn't shocking. Doesn't mean it was easy. Very, very hard on them, but just a different mindset for them. In the Middle Ages, it was even higher infant mortality rate. So I like that they say they invented grandparents. Like you just didn't see grandparents in the Chesapeake region. You did up in New England. Other contrasts between Southern and New England ways of life. We'll see, oddly enough, a little bit more role for women in the Chesapeake because the men were dying off, because there's so few women. They had more say in the society. They'd often come into possession of land because the young husband dies off of malaria or other diseases or anything down there. We see that happen. And so we see women kind of rise to prominence more in the Chesapeake than they ever do in New England. In New England, women, when you got married, you gave up your property rights. Like you could have property, if you got married, it was gone. It's now your husband's property. So it's kind of strange that we see that difference, that the kind of instability of the Chesapeake actually led to more autonomy for women, but it did. We see women's rights. We do see it as early as 1600s. When we watch our video on John Adams, Abigail Adams was very much a proponent of women's rights, constantly trying John to get him to work that into the Declaration of Independence, into the Bill of Rights. So all the way into 1600s we see this, but obviously it takes a very long time for women to have any chance to really participate in our government. Let's see. Divorce very rare up in New England. We basically see a very close-knit family, but then also because it's a church and state together, divorce would be punished by the state. So we see it as a very rare event in the Puritan colonies. Adultery was another thing you rarely saw because of the punishment that came with it. Again, you guys have not read Scarlet Letter, right? Is it part of your curriculum? No. Okay. So that just tells the story of a woman in New England who gets branded as an adulteress. So she has to wear that letter on her wherever she goes. So the harsh treatment of it. So we get kind of a close-knit society up in New England, small villages and towns. They laid out the towns. They had a town square. They'd have a place for education up in New England, so people, children were going to get educated. It grew very orderly, very planned. That's what we see up in New England.
At this time, was education still very class and gender based?
Yes, very much. So no concept of public education at all. If you're going to go to a college, they start to create those up in Puritan New England. You're still going to go in your teens, but only the elite would go. If your parents have had tutors and taught you Latin and Greek, then you're going to end up going, but most people do not go. So right in the town, and this is important because this is where a lot of the Revolutionary War will begin up in Puritan New England. They had a spot for the militia to drill in the green. They had a school building early on. Each family would receive a parcel of land that was suitable for growing a family, providing for a family. Towns of over 50 families are required to provide elementary education. You'll see that on page 72. That's significant. So you just see a very different establishment up in New England from down in the Chesapeake. Pay attention to the halfway covenant. That's significant. Basically, as church attendance starts to decline, they lighten the regulation to become a member of the church. That way you can also vote. So make sure you know the halfway covenant for tomorrow, and the Jeremiahs, these kind of hellfire and brimstone preaching.
You mean Thursday?
I keep saying tomorrow. Yes, Thursday. Thank you. Don't mean this. scare you. And I think that's it. I think you can cover that. Salem Witch Trials is in there, so take a look at that, but you read about it. That's it. All right, I'll see you guys Thursday. Get the 6 degrees of separation done. TJ, I'll see you.
Do you have any homework for today?
Okay. Actually, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you like email me or cause for the code, because I just got the email when you like just started lecturing.
Oh, yeah.
Albert.
Yeah, I'll send you an invitation.
Okay. Thank
All
you.
right. Sorry, can't see my head. See you, man.